Hunger is a serrated blade that carves the pride right out of a man's ribs until there is nothing left but the raw, red meat of desperation. I stood in the rain-slick gravel of the industrial district, the neon pulse of a broken sign bleeding a sickly crimson into the oily puddles like an open vein. My resume was a masterpiece of lies, a frantic attempt to paper over the black hole of my criminal record. But in this part of the city, nobody checked for truth. They only checked for a pulse and a willingness to disappear into the graveyard shift. I needed this. I needed the paycheck more than I needed my dignity, even if it meant working in a place that looked like it had been coughed up by the earth and left to rot under a smog-choked sky. The iron door of the Thorne Logistics warehouse groaned as I pushed it open, a metallic shriek that set my teeth on edge and vibrated deep in my marrow. The air inside didn't just smell like dust, it smelled like stagnant time, thick with the scent of oxidized copper, wet wool, and something underlying it all, a faint, cloying sweetness like lilies left to liquefy in a funeral vase. Dim, flickering amber lights hung from a ceiling so high it was swallowed by a shifting, velvet darkness, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the crates and crawl along the walls. It was a cathedral of forgotten commerce, a hollowed-out ribcage of a building that felt like it was exhaling a cold, damp breath against the back of my neck. Then there was Silas Thorne. He didn't walk so much as emerge from the static of the shadows, a silhouette that sharpened into a man who looked like he'd been carved out of grey soapstone. His suit was sharp enough to draw blood, a charcoal three-piece that felt decades out of time, smelling of mothballs and ancient tobacco. His skin was the color of a drowned moon, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for his neck. But it was his eyes that truly unnerved me, flat, glassy marbles that reflected the amber flickers of the overhead lights but held no warmth, no flicker of humanity. When he spoke, it sounded like dry leaves skittering across a concrete floor, a raspy, rhythmic cadence that made my skin crawl. "The night is long here, Alex," he whispered, my name sounding like a foreign curse in his mouth. "The silence is heavy. Most men find they aren't strong enough to carry it." I told him I could carry anything for a living wage, my voice cracking under the weight of my own lie. I was an ex-con with empty pockets and a hollow gut. I'd have mopped the floors of hell if the overtime was right. He handed me a ring of heavy, tarnished brass keys that felt impossibly cold, their weight pulling at my hand like lead. He gestured toward a wall where a set of faded, yellowed blueprints was pinned, the paper curling at the edges like scorched skin. He walked me through the tasks with a clinical, terrifying precision. Buff the loading docks, sanitize the packing stations, and then his pale, trembling finger traced a path toward the back of the facility, where the light seemed to die completely. "You will clean the basement," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a jagged vibration in the air. My eyes darted back to the blueprints. There was no basement. The schematic showed a solid, reinforced slab of concrete designed to hold millions of tons of industrial weight. There was no void beneath us, no sublevel, just the unyielding earth. Silas didn't acknowledge my confusion. He simply turned and vanished back into the gloom of his office, the door clicking shut with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. I was left alone in the amber-tinted purgatory of the warehouse floor. The silence slammed shut around me, a physical pressure that made my ears ring with a high-pitched, electric hum. Every step I took across the expanse sounded like a gunshot, the echo returning to me a second too late, as if the building were mocking my presence, or perhaps waiting for me to fail. The air felt thick, charged with a static tension that made the hair on my arm stand up. I gripped the mop handle until my knuckles turned white, the wood feeling like a splintered bone. I was a man at the end of his rope, and as I stared into the yawning darkness at the back of the warehouse, I realized I had just tied a noose out of a job description. Somewhere in that lightless void, a basement that didn't exist was waiting to be cleaned, a hollow mouth beneath the floorboards of reality, ready to swallow me whole. The warehouse was a cathedral built for the worship of dust and silence. Above me, the industrial lights hummed with a violent, electric headache, pouring a flat, surgical white over every surface. It was not the kind of light that revealed things. It was the kind that bleached the world until your retinas felt like they were being scraped with a straight razor. I pushed my cleaning cart, the wheels screaming a high-pitched, rhythmic protest against the polished concrete, a sound that echoed back from the distant, unseen rafters like a mocking bird made of rusted iron. Silas Thorne had looked at me with eyes that were two dead marbles and told me to get to work. He did not care about my record. He did not care that the ink on my release papers was barely dry. He just wanted the basement cleaned. I pulled the blueprints from the pocket of my canvas jacket. They were yellowed and brittle, smelling of damp attics and forgotten secrets. My thumb traced the lines of the building's footprint. It was a simple rectangle, 4 walls of corrugated steel and a slab of reinforced concrete. There was no mention of an underground level, no subflooring, no crawl spaces, just a solid foundation meant to hold up the weight of a million crates of nothingness. My mind felt like a skipping record, caught on the jagged edge of a logic that would not seat properly. If there was no basement on the map, where the hell was I supposed to go? The air grew colder as I moved toward the rear of the facility, past rows of shelving that stretched upward into the shadows like the ribs of a gargantuan beast. The light here was even harsher, a stuttering strobe that made my movements feel frantic and disjointed. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, pinned down by the glare. Every shadow cast by the towering crates seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency static. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped animal looking for an exit that did not exist. I stopped in the middle of aisle 44, the silence pressing against my eardrums until they throbbed. I checked the map again. According to the scribbled notes Thorne had left me, the entrance was supposed to be right here, behind a stack of rotted wooden pallets. I moved them aside, the wood splintering under my calloused hands like old bone. My breath hitched in my throat. There, cut directly into the floor, was a rectangular void. It was not a hatch. It was not a door. It was as if the concrete had simply given up, surrendering its solidity to something that should not have been there. The stairwell did not look like part of a warehouse. It looked like it had been ripped out of a 1970s suburban home and shoved into the gut of this industrial hellscape. The walls were covered in a peeling, floral wallpaper that looked like bruised skin, and the stairs were draped in a thick, shag carpet the color of dried blood. It descended steeply into a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight. The transition was so abrupt it made my stomach lurch. One moment I was standing on cold, grey concrete under the howl of fluorescent tubes, and the next, I was staring at a domestic nightmare carved into the earth. I knelt at the edge of the opening. The carpet looked wet, or maybe it was just the way the light died against the fibers. A smell wafted up from the depths, a cloying mixture of mothballs, lavender, and something sharp and metallic, like pennies sitting in a pool of warm grease. It was the smell of a house that had been closed up for decades while something inside went soft and rotten. My skin crawled, 1,000 invisible insects dancing across my neck. This was a violation of geometry. This was a spatial cancer eating away at the warehouse floor. I looked back at the warehouse. The harsh white light seemed distant now, a pale imitation of safety. The shelves looked like rows of tombstones. I thought about walking away. I thought about the bus ride back to my cramped apartment and the empty fridge and the parole officer who looked at me like I was a cockroach that had survived a nuclear blast. I needed the money. But as I looked back at that staircase, the confusion turned into a cold, hard knot of dread. Why was there a residential stairwell in the middle of a distribution center? Why did the blueprints lie? The silence of the warehouse began to change. The hum of the lights grew rhythmic, a pulsing thrum that synchronized with the beating of my own blood. I could hear something else, too. A faint, rhythmic creaking from the darkness below, like a rocking chair moving on a warped floorboard. It was a domestic sound, a peaceful sound, and in this echoing void of steel and shadow, it was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. I reached out and touched the wallpaper at the top of the stairs. It felt greasy. Beneath the floral pattern, I could see dark stains that looked like handprints, as if someone had been trying to claw their way back up into the light. My fingers trembled. I was not just looking at a basement. I was looking at a wound in the world. The industrial white light behind me flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for the opening. It felt like the warehouse was trying to push me in, trying to rid itself of the infection that lived beneath its skin. I took a step down. The carpet muffled the sound of my boot, swallowing the impact with a sickening softness. The air changed instantly. It was thick and stagnant, the kind of air that hangs in a room where a fever has broken. I looked up one last time at the ceiling of the warehouse, the flickering tubes now looking like distant, dying stars. The logic of my life, the cold reality of concrete and steel, was dissolving into this floral-patterned abyss. I was an intruder in a space that defied mapping, a custodian assigned to clean a ghost. The confusion was a fog in my brain. I kept trying to reconcile the blueprints with the reality beneath my feet. A basement that did not exist. A stairwell made of memories and rot. My watch, a cheap digital thing that had survived 3 years in the yard, suddenly hissed with a burst of static. The numbers began to scramble, spinning through hours and minutes in a blur of liquid crystal until the screen went black. Time was the first thing to die in this place. I descended another step. The light from the warehouse could not reach me here. It seemed to stop at the threshold, a flat plane of white that refused to illuminate the floral walls. I was descending into a mouth. The creaking below stopped. In its place came a sound that made the hair on my arm stand up, a soft, wet intake of breath, like a lung filling with swamp water. I gripped the banister, my knuckles turning white. The wood was cold, impossibly cold, like a rail of ice. I thought about Silas Thorne. I thought about his still, waxen face and the way he had not blinked once during the interview. He had sent me here knowing the maps were wrong. He had sent me here because I was a man the world would not miss, a man who already lived in the shadows. I felt a surge of jagged anger, a visceral heat that briefly pushed back the cold. But the anger died as soon as I heard the first sob. It was faint, muffled by layers of carpet and wallpaper, but it was there. A child crying in a basement that did not exist. I was no longer in a warehouse. I was in the gut of a secret. The stairs continued down, further than the foundation of the building should have allowed. I was walking through the concrete, through the earth itself, guided by a domestic architecture of madness. The harsh industrial white was a memory. The only thing that mattered now was the next step, and the rotting smell of a home that had never been built, yet refused to die. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run until my lungs burned and the lights of the city washed away the smell of lavender and grease. But the staircase held me. It was a jagged line drawn through reality, and I was the ink being pulled down its length, deeper into the void that Silas Thorne had prepared for me. The transition was a physical blow, a sudden change in pressure that made my inner ears pop and my stomach churn with a sudden, violent vertigo. One moment I was standing on the cold, unforgiving slab of the warehouse floor, surrounded by the smell of industrial grease and the hum of distant transformers. The next, I was stepping onto thick, moth-eaten carpet that drank the sound of my heavy work boots. The air changed instantly. It lost its metallic edge, replaced by a suffocating, overheated domesticity, the scent of stale tobacco, lavender water, and the underlying, sweet rot of something trapped behind the drywall. I looked back over my shoulder, expecting to see the safety of the loading docks and the dim yellow safety lines of the warehouse floor. There was nothing but a door. It was a heavy thing, dark mahogany with a brass handle that looked like a tarnished bone. There was no frame, no wall around it at first, just the door standing upright in the middle of a room that shouldn't have existed. Then, the edges of my vision began to bleed. The shadows stretched and knitted themselves together into walls, and suddenly I was standing in a parlor that felt like it had been preserved in amber since the late 50s. The lighting was a jaundiced, sickly glow, the color of a bruise that refuses to heal. It spilled from a scalloped floor lamp in the corner, its silk shade stained with decades of nicotine. The wallpaper was a repeating pattern of pale roses, but as I stared, the floral shapes seemed to distort, their petals curling into the likeness of screaming mouths or grasping fingers. The room was a nightmare of domesticity. A floral sofa, its fabric worn thin at the armrests, faced a television set that was nothing but a hulking wooden box. The screen was dark, but the glass hummed with a static charge that made the hair on my arm stand up. I reached for the door handle, my breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. My fingers closed around the brass, but it didn't turn. It didn't even feel like metal. It felt like cold, wet skin. I yanked, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but the door was no longer a door. It was just a slab of wood fused into the architecture of this impossible place. I was a rat in a maze, and the walls were already beginning to pulse with a slow, rhythmic heat. I checked my watch, a habit from the yard, where every second was a currency. The digital face was hemorrhaging black ink. The numbers scrambled, melting into jagged, nonsensical glyphs before the glass screen cracked with a sharp, crystalline pop. The second hand of my internal clock stopped. Time here wasn't a river. It was a stagnant pool, thick and black and filled with things that didn't know how to die. I moved deeper into the parlor, my boots sinking into the carpet. It felt less like fabric and more like walking on damp soil. Every step released a fresh puff of that cloying, floral decay. I found a hallway at the far end of the room, a long, narrow throat of a corridor that seemed to stretch further than the entire footprint of the warehouse above. The walls were lined with framed photographs, but the glass was frosted with a layer of grime so thick I couldn't see the faces. Only the shapes, dark silhouettes of a family that felt like a threat. As I walked, The floorboards groaned with a sound that wasn't wood on wood. It was the sound of a throat clearing, a wet, rattling noise that followed me. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the sickly yellow gloom, but there was no parlor behind me anymore. The living room had vanished, replaced by more hallway, more doors, more suffocating darkness. The geography was a fluid, predatory thing. It was shifting behind my back, rearranging its guts to ensure I couldn't find the way I came in. The heat intensified. It was an oily, humid warmth that made my sweat feel thick on my skin. I reached a door that was painted a faded, peeling white, the color of a dead man's fingernail. From behind, it came a sound that made my blood turn to slush. It was the rhythmic, hypnotic thud of wood on wood. A rocking motion. I pushed the door open. The nursery was bathed in a deep, visceral red light that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards. It was a small room, cramped and overflowing with the debris of a childhood cut short. Broken wooden soldiers lay scattered across the floor like a miniature massacre. A mobile of paper stars hung from the ceiling, but they weren't stars. They were jagged, multi-limbed shapes that twirled in a draft I couldn't feel. In the center of the room sat the crib. It was an antique thing, heavy and dark, and it was rocking violently. There was no one in the room. No breeze. No hand to push it. Yet the crib swung back and forth with such force that the legs bit into the floor, creating a rhythmic, bone-deep vibration. I stepped closer, drawn by a morbid, sickening curiosity I couldn't suppress. The air inside the nursery tasted like copper, blood, and old pennies. I peered over the railing of the crib, expecting to see a void, but what I saw was worse. The blankets were moving. They were being bunched up and kneaded by invisible hands. I could see the indentations of tiny fingers, the weight of a small body shifting beneath the wool. And then, the sound began. Not a cry, but a wet, rattling wheeze, like a pair of lungs filled with fluid. It was the sound of a child trying to breathe through a throat that had been crushed. I backed away, my hand shaking so violently I nearly dropped my light. As I hit the doorframe, the rocking stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that precedes a scream. The red light flared, the shadows in the corners of the room lengthening into spindly, arachnid shapes that crawled toward me along the ceiling. I bolted. I ran back into the hallway, but the hallway was gone. I was standing in a kitchen now, a space filled with the smell of scorched fat and something much worse, rotting meat. The linoleum under my feet was slick with a translucent film. The cabinets were all standing open, their interiors dark and cavernous. I ran past a heavy oak table where 3 plates were set, each piled high with what looked like grey, pulpy ash. Every door I opened led to another iteration of this domestic purgatory. A bathroom where the tub was overflowing with a thick, black bile that smelled of the sewer. A sewing room where the mannequins seemed to turn their faceless heads to follow my progress. A dining room where the chandelier flickered with the rhythm of a failing heart. I checked my watch again, though I knew it was useless. The crack in the glass had widened, and a dark, oily liquid was beginning to leak out of the internal components, staining my wrist. How long had I been down here? Minutes? Hours? The concept of time had become a joke, a fading memory of the world above where things made sense and gravity worked, and Silas Thorne was just a man with a job offer. The air grew colder now, a sudden, biting chill that cut through the humid rot of the house. The yellow glow of the lamps began to flicker and die, replaced by a grey, ash-coloured gloom. The walls began to peel in earnest, great strips of wallpaper falling away like dead skin to reveal not lath and plaster, but raw, pulsing meat. The house was breathing. I could feel the floorboards rise and fall beneath my boots, a slow, tectonic heave that made the entire world tilt. I found myself back in a hallway, but this one was different. The doors here were numerous, dozens of them, packed tight against each other like the teeth in a shark's mouth. They were all vibrating, a low-frequency hum that I felt in my teeth. From behind the wood came a cacophony of domestic horrors, the sound of a woman weeping, the snarl of a beast, the wet, rhythmic thud of a butcher's cleaver hitting a block. I was trapped in the architectural equivalent of a stroke. The reality of the warehouse, the concrete, the blueprints, the logic of the night shift, was a million miles away, a dream I had once had about a man named Alex who just wanted a paycheck. Here, in the shifting purgatory of Silas Thorne's basement, I wasn't a man. I was just a witness. I was the ink being pulled through the jagged line of this nightmare, descending further into a void that had been waiting for a visitor for a very long time. I stopped at the end of the hall, where a single, lightless staircase descended into a black pit that seemed to swallow the very light of my torch. The smell of lavender was gone now, replaced entirely by the scent of a fresh grave. I looked down into the dark, and for the first time, I felt the gaze. It wasn't just one set of eyes. It was dozens. They were watching me from the cracks in the walls, from the shadows under the doors, and from the deep, reaching throat of the stairs. The house wasn't just a prison. It was a stomach, and I was finally being digested. The air curdled. It didn't just get colder. It grew thick with the scent of wet wool, iron, and something sweet and cloying, like lilies left to rot in a funeral parlor. The pulsing red light wasn't coming from any bulb or emergency exit sign. It was rhythmic, a slow, thumping heartbeat that emanated from the very wood of the walls, bleeding through the floral wallpaper in jagged streaks of crimson. Every time the light flared, the shadows didn't just stretch, they detached themselves. They became ink-black oil spills that pulled around my boots, hungry and sentient. I stumbled back, my hands searching for the banister of the residential stairwell I'd found carved into the warehouse's concrete gut, but the wood felt like soft, decaying bone under my palm. I looked down at my watch. The second hand was twitching, caught in a frantic, vibrating loop, a tiny metal limb trying to break free from a digital seizure. Time was a broken neck here. It had no direction. A door to my left, heavy oak and scarred by deep gouges, groaned open. The sound was a jagged shard of glass against my eardrums. I didn't want to look, but the red pulse forced my eyes toward the opening. Inside was a living room that looked like a snapshot from a 1970s nightmare. The shag carpet was a sea of moldy avocado green, and sitting in a wingback chair was the silhouette of a man. He was thin, his frame brittle like dried kindling. He didn't turn his head. He didn't have to. The air in my lungs suddenly turned to static. I felt a pressure around my throat, invisible and crushing. I reached up, clawing at my own skin, but there were no hands there, just the phantom weight of a terminal grudge. I was being choked by the memory of a strangulation. The old man in the chair began to vibrate, his form blurring into a grey smudge of motion, and I heard it, a wet, rattling cough that sounded like a shovel hitting dry earth. My knees hit the carpet, the mold soaking into my work pants, and just as the world began to go dark, the pressure vanished. I gasped, drawing in a lungful of dust and the metallic tang of old blood. The room shifted. The green carpet retreated into the floorboards, replaced by cold, cracked linoleum. The wingback chair was gone, and in its place sat a white wicker crib. It was rocking. The motion was violent, erratic, as if something inside was thrashing against the bars. I didn't want to see what was in there. I tried to back away, but the hallway behind me had elongated, the dozens of doors stretching out into a vanishing point of pure, obsidian void. Then came the sound. It wasn't a cry. It was a hollow, echoing weep that felt like it was originating from inside my own skull. It was an invisible infant, a weight of grief so heavy it bowed the floorboards. I saw the indentations on the crib's mattress, tiny, frantic handprints appearing and disappearing in the fabric. The weeping grew louder, rising to a fever pitch that vibrated in my teeth. I turned to run, but the floor felt like it was made of molasses. From the shadows beneath a nearby radiator, a sound emerged that made my skin crawl toward my hairline. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't the sound of a dog protecting a home. It was the sound of a stomach that had been empty for a century. Out of the darkness crawled a shape. It was a dog, or what used to be one. Its fur was gone, replaced by a translucent, weeping skin that showed the frantic pumping of its heart. Its eyes were twin pits of white static. It didn't bark. It just lunged, its jaws snapping inches from my throat, the smell of wet fur and carrion hitting me like a physical blow. I scrambled away, my boots slipping on the slick, impossible floor. I burst through another door, hoping for the warehouse, for the cold comfort of the industrial racks and the hum of the HVAC system. Instead, I found the hallway of doors. It was a gauntlet of rot. The red light pulsed faster now, a panic staccato. I saw her then. She wasn't standing. She was clinging to the ceiling in the far corner, her limbs elongated and bent at impossible, multi-jointed angles. She looked like a human spider, her dress a tattered shroud of grey lace that hung down like cobwebs. Her hair was a matted veil covering her face, but I could feel her eyes, cold, weeping, and full of an ancient, boiling hatred. She dropped. She didn't fall. She descended on invisible threads of malice. I screamed, a sound that died in the heavy, static-filled air. I ran, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every door I passed burst open an inch, revealing flashes of domestic horror. A dining table set with plates of grey meat, a bathroom where the tub overflowed with black bile, a bedroom where the mirrors showed only my own face decaying in real time. Suddenly, the hallway ended. Standing there, bathed in the most intense surge of red light yet, was Silas Thorne. He looked exactly as he had when he hired me, but his eyes were different. They weren't brown anymore. They were the color of a bruised sky. He looked at me with a terrifying, vacant pity. "The family is almost whole, Alex," he whispered. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from the walls. Then, his head didn't just bleed. It erupted. It was a silent, slow-motion explosion of bone, brain, and black ichor. It sprayed across the floral wallpaper, the wet slap of it echoing through the infinite basement. Where his head had been, there was only a jagged stump, venting a thick, oily smoke that smelled like a guttering candle. The Spider-Woman was behind me. I could hear the click-clack of her distorted fingers on the floorboards. I could hear the phantom dog's claws scratching at the wood. I could hear the old man's rattling breath right at my ear. The nursery's weeping had turned into a chorus of shrieks. The house was closing in. The walls were leaning toward me, the ceiling lowering like a lid on a coffin. The red light was blinding now, a solid wall of color that felt like fire. I turned toward the only thing left, a staircase that led down, further into the dark, into a lightless abyss that promised nothing but an end. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I just threw myself into the dark. The stairs were steep, a vertical drop into a throat of shadow. I felt a hand, cold, icy, and impossibly strong, clamp onto my shoulder. The fingers dug into my muscle, a grip that felt like it was trying to claim my very soul. I looked back and saw the weeping woman, her face inches from mine, her mouth a jagged hole of screaming static. I hit the steps and tumbled. Gravity was a suggestion, a cruel joke. I was falling through a vacuum, through the history of a family's terminal despair. I reached out, my fingers scraping against the void, until I saw it, a door handle. It was floating in the dark, upside down, glowing with a ghoulish, sickly red light. I grabbed it. I didn't pull, I wrenched. I put every ounce of my desperation, every bit of the fear I'd accumulated since I first stepped into this godforsaken warehouse, into that single movement. The world cracked. The sound of shattering glass filled the void, and for a second, I saw them all, the old man, the infant, the dog, the woman, and Silas, standing in a circle of white fire, their faces twisted in a final, agonizing plea. Then, the concrete returned. I slammed into the hard, unforgiving floor of the warehouse. The smell of dust and motor oil replaced the stench of rot. The pulsing red was gone, replaced by the flickering, sterile yellow of the overhead fluorescence. I lay there, gasping, my chest heaving, the taste of copper still heavy on my tongue. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, blinding me. "Easy there, son," a voice said. It was Miller, the night security guard. He looked down at me, his face a map of weary concern. "You look like you've been through a meat grinder." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. The basement. Silas Thorne. His. Miller went still. He lowered the flashlight. "Silas Thorne. Kid, you've been standing in this spot for 10 minutes, staring at the floor. Silas Thorne hasn't been in this building for 5 years. Not since he killed his father-in-law, his wife, his kid, and the damn dog right over there by the loading bay. Then he took a shotgun to his own head." I looked at the floor where I'd fallen. It was just grey concrete. No stairs. No red light. "He's dead, Alex," Miller said softly. "The bank owns this place now. There is no basement." I stood up, my legs shaking, my mind a fractured mess of static and shadows. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a break brought on by the stress of the job and my own dark past. But as I turned to leave, as I walked toward the exit and the safety of the night air, I felt a sharp, stinging heat on my shoulder. I pulled back my shirt, and there, in the dim light of the security desk, I saw it. A dark, hand-shaped bruise, etched into my skin like a brand. 5 long, icy fingers, where the woman had caught me in the dark. It wasn't just a bruise. The skin was black, the flesh beneath it cold to the touch, a permanent, physical reminder that while I had escaped the basement, a piece of that family's eternal hatred had decided to come home with me. I could feel her behind me. It wasn't just a sound, though the sound was enough to turn my blood into slush. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking, like heavy shears being forced through thick, rancid meat. The weeping woman was no longer just a shadow in the periphery of my vision. She was a physical presence, an atmospheric pressure that made the air feel heavy and metallic. I ran. My boots hammered against the concrete of the stairs, but the stairs were wrong. They were too steep, the angles sharpened into blades that threatened to slice through the soles of my shoes. Every time I looked down, the staircase extended further into a throat of absolute, lightless ink. There was no bottom. There was only the descent. My lungs burned with the taste of old, recycled air and the copper tang of my own terror. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, but the surface was no longer cold cinderblock. It was warm. It felt like soft, bruised fruit, yielding and damp under my palms. I pulled my hand back with a snarl of disgust, wiping the slime onto my jeans, but the sensation lingered, a phantom touch that felt like thousands of tiny, invisible needles pricking my skin. Behind me, the weeping intensified. It was a high, thin sound that vibrated in the marrow of my bones, a sound of such profound, agonizing grief that I felt my own heart stutter in sympathy before the primal instinct to survive overrode the pity. The nursery had been the worst. I could still see the crib in the strobe light flashes of my failing mind. It had been rocking with a violent, unnatural force, the wood splintering against the floorboards. There was no baby inside, only a dense, swirling cloud of black static that hummed with the sound of 1,000 angry wasps. When I had passed it, the static had reached out, brushing against my cheek, and for a second, I had seen the world through its eyes, a world of grey ash and eternal hunger. Now, that same hunger was at my back. I could hear the spider-like scuttle of her limbs, the unnatural speed of something that didn't have to obey the geometry of a sane world. Then, the floor vanished. I didn't trip. I didn't stumble. Reality simply ceased to support my weight. One moment I was slamming my weight onto a step, and the next, there was nothing but the void. The transition was so sudden it felt like being hit by a freight train of silence. I was falling, but gravity felt skewed, pulling me sideways as much as down. The air around me turned into a thick, gelatinous soup of absolute darkness. I couldn't see my own hands. I couldn't see the walls. I was a speck of dust in the throat of a god. The panic was a living thing, a jagged blade twisting in my gut. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void before it could even leave my throat. There was no echo. There was no wind. Just the sensation of my internal organs floating, the terrifying weightlessness of a body that no longer knew which way was up. I flailed, my fingers clawing at the emptiness, hoping to catch a ledge, a pipe, a wire, anything that belonged to the world of the living. And then I saw it. It was a pinprick of light, miles away or inches from my face. I couldn't tell. It was a deep, ghoulish red, the color of a dying ember or a fresh wound. As I tumbled through the dark, the light grew, taking shape. It was an upside-down door handle, floating in the middle of the abyss. It glowed with a sick, rhythmic pulse, casting long, distorted shadows across the nothingness. It was the only thing in the universe that had form, and I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that if I missed it, I would fall forever. I reached out, my muscles screaming, my joints popping as I fought against the strange, shifting currents of the void. The weeping was louder now, right in my ear, a cold breath smelling of wet earth and ancient rot. I felt a hand, a heavy, icy hand with fingers like frozen iron, clamp onto my shoulder. The grip was so tight I felt my collarbone groan. She had me. The woman from the basement, the manifestation of all that calcified hatred, was pulling me back into the dark. I screamed then, a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated defiance. With a strength born of total desperation, I lunged toward the red light. My fingers brushed the cold metal of the handle. It was vibrating, humming with a low-frequency dread that made my teeth ache. I gripped it and twisted. The world shattered. It felt like being pulled through a straw. My body was compressed, stretched, and then violently ejected. I hit a hard, flat surface with a force that knocked the wind out of my lungs and sent stars dancing across my vision. I lay there for a long time, gasping, my face pressed against cold, dusty concrete. The smell was different here. It wasn't the smell of the basement. It was the smell of old grease, cardboard, and the faint, ozone scent of industrial heaters. I was back in the warehouse. I tried to push myself up, but my limbs felt like lead. My shoulder throbbed with a rhythmic, pulsing heat that made me want to vomit. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dim, yellow glow of the high bay sodium lights. I was lying in the middle of an aisle, surrounded by towering racks of crates that suddenly looked like the most beautiful things I had ever seen. They were solid. They were real. They didn't shift when I looked away. A shadow fell over me. I flinched, pulling myself backward, my heels scraping against the floor until I hit the base of a shelving unit. "Easy there, son. You look like you've gone 10 rounds with a ghost." It was Miller, the night security guard. He was standing over me, his flashlight off, his face etched with a look of weary, ancient pity. He held out a hand, but I didn't take it. I couldn't stop shaking. My breath was coming in short, jagged hitches that sounded like sobbing. "Where is he?" I managed to choke out, my voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Where's Silas Thorne?" Miller sighed, a long, heavy sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire building. He leaned against a nearby crate and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, staring at the ceiling. "Silas Thorne? Kid, Silas Thorne hasn't been on the payroll here for a long time. He's been dead for 6 years." I froze. The coldness from the basement seemed to seep back into my bones. But I just saw him. He hired me. He gave me the keys. He told me to clean the basement. Miller looked at me then, and his eyes were full of a terrible, quiet sorrow. "There is no basement, Alex. At least, not one on the blueprints. But people see things in this place. They see Silas. He was the floor manager back then. Good man, or so they thought. Until something in his head just snapped." Miller took a slow drag of his cigarette, the smoke curling into the rafters. "One night, right about this time, he brought his family here. His father-in-law, his wife, his little girl, even the family dog. He led them into the back of the warehouse, right where you're sitting now. He told them he had a surprise for them. And then he used a heavy-duty nail gun and a hunting knife to make sure none of them ever left. He saved himself for last. It was a mess. A god-awful, bloody mess that the cleaning crews couldn't fully scrub away. The company tried to bury the story, but the building remembers." I looked down at the floor, at the exact spot where I had collapsed. The concrete looked clean, but in the dim light, I could almost see the outlines of something darker, something permanent. "You were only gone 10 minutes, Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I saw you walk toward the back, and then you just vanished. I thought you'd quit and run out the back door until I heard you scream and saw you drop out of thin air onto the floor. You're lucky, Alex. Most people Silas invites to the basement don't come back at all." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back at Miller. I didn't look back at the warehouse. I just wanted to be under the sky, away from the shifting walls and the weeping sounds. When I got to my car, I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at my hands. They were covered in a fine, grey dust that smelled of wood rot and old flowers. I reached up to rub my aching shoulder, and that's when I felt it. The skin was tight, inflamed, and impossibly cold. I pulled my shirt aside and looked in the rearview mirror. My breath caught in my throat. There, etched into my skin like a brand, was a dark, hand-shaped bruise. 5 long, icy fingers, where the woman had caught me in the dark. It wasn't just a bruise. The skin was black, the flesh beneath it cold to the touch, a permanent, physical reminder that while I had escaped the basement, a piece of that family's eternal hatred had decided to come home with me. I could still feel the coldness spreading, a slow, necrotic frost that whispered of the void, reminding me that some doors, once opened, never truly close. I started the car and drove, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still falling, and that somewhere, in a basement that didn't exist, a crib was still rocking in the dark. The red light didn't just fade, it tore. It was a jagged, screaming rupture in the fabric of the dark, and as I hauled my weight through that impossible threshold, the world didn't catch me, it rejected me. I hit the concrete floor of the warehouse with a sound like a wet sack of grain hitting a butcher's block. The impact vibrated through my teeth, a dull, thudding reality that tasted of iron and ancient dust. For a long, agonizing minute, I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they had been filled with cold mercury, heavy and unmoving, while the air in the warehouse, stagnant, smelling of motor oil and cardboard, felt like a luxury I didn't deserve. I lay there, my cheek pressed against the freezing grit of the floor, watching the shadows of the high bay racking dance in the peripheral flicker of a dying fluorescent tube overhead. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on my eardrums until they throbbed with the rhythm of my own frantic heart. I scrambled backward, my boots scuffing the floor, looking for the door, looking for the stairs, looking for the red-lit handle that had been my only salvation. But there was nothing. Behind me stood a solid wall of industrial shelving, stack high with rusted engine blocks wrapped in yellowing plastic. No residential wallpaper, no rocking cribs, no scent of rotting lilies and wet fur, just the hollow, cavernous void of the night shift. A beam of light, sharp and clinical, cut through the gloom. It hit my eyes like a physical blow, searing the retinas. I threw an arm up, shielding my face, a sob catching in my throat. I expected the old man with the strangling hands. I expected the Spider-Woman to drop from the rafters, her joints clicking like a Geiger counter in a fallout zone. Instead, I heard the heavy, rhythmic clack of leather soles on concrete. "Easy there, son," a voice rasped. It was a dry, sandpaper sound, weary and stripped of hope. "You look like you've been through the thresher and spit out the other side." I squinted past my forearm. It was Miller, the night security guard. He stood a few feet away, his flashlight angled toward the floor now, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched toward the back of the warehouse. He looked older than he had when I clocked in, his face a map of deep-set lines and grey stubble, his eyes two sunken pits of exhaustion. He didn't look surprised to find a sweating, trembling ex-con collapsed on the floor in a forbidden sector of the building. He looked like he was expecting me. I found it. I managed to choke out, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "The basement. Thorne told me to clean the basement." Miller didn't move. He didn't offer a hand. He just sighed, a long, whistling breath that smelled of cheap tobacco and stale coffee. "Thorne hasn't told anyone to do anything for a long time, Alex." I shook my head, the movement sending a spike of vertigo through my skull. "No, he hired me. Tonight. At the main office. He gave me the list. He was wearing that grey suit, that slicked back hair." Miller clicked the flashlight off, plunging us into the dim, grey half-light of the pre-dawn warehouse. The silence returned, thicker than before. He reached into the pocket of his heavy wool coat and pulled out a tattered, yellowed newspaper clipping. He stepped closer, dropping it onto the floor next to my hand. The paper felt like dried skin. "Silas Thorne didn't hire you, Alex. Silas Thorne died in 1998. Right here, underneath where you're sitting." I looked down at the clipping. The headline was a jagged scream in black ink, "Tragedy at Thorne Logistics." Beneath it was a grainy photograph of the man who had interviewed me. The same sharp nose, the same predatory eyes. But in the photo, he wasn't smiling. He was being wheeled out of this very building in a black nylon bag. I felt a coldness start at the base of my spine, a static hiss in my marrow that told me my soul was already beginning to fray. The article didn't just talk about a death. It talked about an ending. Silas Thorne hadn't just been a businessman. He'd been a monster in a tailored suit. He'd gone home one night, or perhaps he'd brought the home to the warehouse. He had lured his father-in-law, his wife, his infant son, and even the family dog into a makeshift living space he'd built in the storage sublevels, a place he called his sanctuary. Then, with the methodical precision of a man filing a tax return, he had butchered them. He'd strangled the old man in his sleep. He'd broken his wife's limbs until she could only crawl like an insect, then left her to rot in the dark. He'd let the dog starve until it turned into something skeletal and ravenous, and the baby had just been left in a crib to cry until the air ran out. And when the work was done, Silas had sat in the center of that manufactured domestic hell and put a shotgun in his mouth. My stomach turned, a violent heave that brought up nothing but bile. The rooms, the shifting hallway, the nursery. I hadn't been in a basement. I'd been in a memory, a physical manifestation of a slaughter that the concrete couldn't forget. "You've been gone 10 minutes, Alex," Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic drone. "I saw you walk toward the back wall, and then you just thinned out, like smoke in a breeze. You were standing right where he did it, right where the blood soaked into the foundation and stayed there. 10 minutes. I gripped my hair, my fingers digging into my scalp. It felt like years. I felt the weight of decades in my bones. I felt the phantom pressure of the old man's thumbs on my windpipe, the icy brush of the Spider-Woman's hair against my neck. He does this, Miller continued, looking up at the high, shadowed ceiling. He's a recruiter, always looking for more witnesses, more people to share the weight of what he built down there. He shows you the basement because the basement is all he has left. It's a purgatory fueled by the hate of the people he murdered. They aren't just ghosts, Alex. They're echoes of a pain so loud it warped the geometry of the world. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaking so violently I had to lean against a support pillar for balance. The metal was freezing, vibrating with the distant hum of the city outside, a world that suddenly felt alien and unreachable. I looked at my watch. The hands were still frozen, the glass cracked from the inside. "I'm leaving," I whispered. "I'm not coming back." Miller didn't stop me. He just watched with those dead, hollow eyes as I stumbled toward the loading bay doors. "You can leave the building, son," he called out as I reached the exit. "But you don't just walk away from a place like that. You took something with you. Or maybe, something took a piece of you." I burst out into the morning air. It was a cold, slate-grey dawn, the sky heavy with the promise of sleet. The city was a jagged silhouette of steel and glass, indifferent to the nightmare I had just clawed my way out of. I reached my car, my hands fumbling with the keys, my breath coming in ragged, white plumes. I needed to see myself. I needed to see something real. I adjusted the rearview mirror, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pulled the collar of my shirt down, my skin crawling with a sudden, localized heat. There, on my shoulder, was a mark. It wasn't a bruise, not a normal one. It was a dark, bruised handprint, the fingers long and unnaturally thin, the skin beneath it blackened and sunken as if the very cells had been flash frozen. It was the mark of the woman in the dark, the one who had chased me to the edge of the abyss. I started the engine, the vibration of the car a frantic, mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the silence of the warehouse. I drove. I drove until the warehouse was a speck in the distance, until the grey light of the morning turned into the dull, oppressive silver of a rainy day. But as I sat at a red light, staring at the raindrops racing down the windshield, I realized the static hadn't stopped. It was a low-frequency hum in the back of my skull, a reminder that the laws of physics were just a thin, fragile crust over a boiling sea of madness. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. I looked at the shoulder of my jacket, where the phantom grip still felt heavy, a permanent weight I would carry to my grave. Miller was right. I hadn't escaped. I had just changed the scenery. The frost outside whispered of the void, reminding me that some doors, once opened, never truly close. I started the car and drove, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still falling, and that somewhere, in a basement that didn't exist, a crib was still rocking in the dark. And Silas Thorne was still sitting there, in his grey suit and his slicked back hair, waiting for the next shift to start. Waiting for the next man desperate enough to look for a job in a place where time goes to die. The warehouse wasn't just a building. It was an organ, a giant, concrete heart that beat with the rhythm of a family's eternal scream. And I was just a new cell, infected by the rot, carrying the basement with me in every shadow I crossed, every dark corner I turned, until the day the red light finally finds me again and pulls me back down into the concrete for good.